Welcome to Wise Files. Please do not forget to subscribe, like the video, and share the video with your circle. We need your support to reach 1,000 members. Let us know where you are from and what time it is now in the comments. The year 1917 marked a turning point in Detroit's criminal landscape as old loyalties crumbled and new alliances formed amid the chaos of a changing world. While America prepared to enter the Great War overseas, a different kind of warfare was brewing in the streets of the Motor City, one that would reshape the underworld for decades to come. Giovanni "Bloody John" Vitale had served faithfully as an enforcer for the Gianola brothers, carrying out their orders with the kind of brutal efficiency that had earned him his nickname. Born in Sicily in 1885, Vitale had arrived in Detroit as a young man, seeking the same American dream that drew thousands of Italian immigrants to the rapidly industrializing city. Like many of his contemporaries, he found that the path to prosperity often ran through Detroit's shadowy underworld. For years, Vitale had been a reliable soldier in the Gianola organization, but loyalty in the criminal world could be a fragile thing. When Tony Gianola made the fateful decision to order the execution of Sam Bosco, he unknowingly lit the fuse that would explode his own empire. Bosco was more than just another associate to Vitale. He was a trusted ally, perhaps even a friend in a world where such relationships were rare and precious. The murder of Sam Bosco in 1917 represented more than just another violent settling of accounts. It was a miscalculation that would cost the Gianola family dearly. Vitale's reaction was swift and merciless. Drawing upon his network of contacts and his reputation for violence, he declared war on his former employers, beginning what would become known as the Gianola-Vitale conflict. The war that followed was unlike anything Detroit had seen before. For 3 bloody years, from 1917 to 1920, the city's Italian neighborhoods became a battleground. Bodies began appearing in alleys, floating in the Detroit River, and slumped behind the wheels of automobiles. The violence was so intense and widespread that even the local newspapers, already accustomed to reporting on organized crime activities, struggled to keep pace with the mounting death toll. During these tumultuous years, dozens of men lost their lives. Some were seasoned criminals who understood the risks of their chosen profession. Others were innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of a conflict they barely understood. The violence reached into legitimate businesses, disrupted neighborhood life, and created an atmosphere of fear that permeated Detroit's Italian-American community. As the war raged on, it became clear that neither side could achieve total victory. The constant bloodshed was drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement and disrupting the very businesses that made organized crime profitable. By 1920, wiser heads within the community recognized that peace was not just preferable, it was essential for survival. Enter Salvatore, Singing Sam, Catalanotte, a respected figure whose nickname reflected his earlier career as an entertainer before he became involved in more illicit pursuits. Catalanotte possessed the kind of diplomatic skills that were desperately needed in this volatile situation. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who relied solely on intimidation and violence, Catalanotte understood the art of negotiation and compromise. Born in Palermo in 1894, Catalanotte had immigrated to Detroit in his youth and established himself as both a legitimate businessman and a criminal entrepreneur. His dual existence gave him credibility with both law-abiding citizens and underworld figures, making him an ideal mediator. His reputation for fairness and his connections throughout the community positioned him perfectly to broker the peace that everyone secretly desired. The peace conference that Catalanot organized in 1920 was a masterpiece of underworld diplomacy. Rather than attempting to declare a winner in the devastating conflict, he proposed a solution that would allow all surviving factions to prosper: territorial division. Detroit would be split between East Side and West Side operations, with clear boundaries and spheres of influence that would minimize future conflicts. This territorial arrangement reflected the practical realities of Detroit's geography and ethnic neighborhoods. The city's sprawling layout, with distinct communities separated by major thoroughfares and the Detroit River, naturally lent itself to such divisions. By formalizing these boundaries, Catalanot's peace plan provided a framework for coexistence that could benefit everyone involved. The East Side faction emerged under the joint leadership of two former Janela lieutenants who had survived the chaos of the previous years. Joseph Joe Uno Zerilli, whose nickname reflected his position as the primary leader, brought both ambition and organizational skills to his new role. Born in Sicily in 1897, Zerilli had immigrated to Detroit as a child and grown up understanding both the legitimate opportunities and criminal possibilities that the city offered. Alongside Zerilli stood William Black Bill Tocco, whose dark complexion had earned him his distinctive moniker. Tocco, born in 1897 in Terracini, Sicily, had arrived in Detroit during his teenage years and quickly adapted to his new environment. His partnership with Zerilli represented more than just a convenient alliance. It was a recognition that effective leadership required both vision and pragmatic implementation. The West Side faction fell under the control of Chester Big Chet Lemaire, whose impressive physical presence matched his ambitious personality. Lemaire understood that controlling territory meant more than just marking boundaries on a map. It required establishing profitable enterprises and maintaining the respect of both subordinates and rivals. His leadership style emphasized both business acumen and the strategic use of force when necessary. Lemaire's organization controlled some of Detroit's most lucrative criminal opportunities. The West Side and Downriver areas provided excellent access to Canada, making them ideal for the bootlegging operations that would soon become enormously profitable with the advent of Prohibition. These geographic advantages, combined with Lemaire's organizational abilities, positioned his faction for significant growth in the coming decade. The peace established by Catalanot's conference proved to be remarkably durable, providing the foundation for years of relative stability in Detroit's underworld. The territorial divisions allowed each faction to focus on developing their criminal enterprises rather than constantly defending against rivals. This stability would prove crucial as new opportunities emerged with the implementation of Prohibition just months after the peace agreement. The resolution of the Gianola Vitale War marked the end of an era in Detroit organized crime. The old-style family feuds and personal vendettas gave way to a more business-like approach to criminal enterprises. The leaders who emerged from this period understood that sustainable success required careful planning, territorial respect, and the kinds of political connections that could protect their operations from law enforcement interference. As 1920 drew to a close, Detroit's underworld had been fundamentally transformed. The bloodshed of the previous 3 years had cleared away the old order, making room for new leadership that would guide organized crime in the city for the next several decades. The peace conference had not just ended the war, it had laid the groundwork for a new kind of criminal organization, one that would prove remarkably adaptable to the challenges and opportunities of the modern era. The stage was now set for the next chapter in Detroit's criminal history. With territorial boundaries established and leadership structures in place, both the East Side and West Side factions were positioned to take advantage of the unprecedented opportunities that Prohibition would soon provide. The lessons learned during the violent years of 1917 to 1920 would serve them well as they built criminal empires that would influence Detroit for generations to come. The winter of 1930 was particularly harsh in Detroit, but the cold that settled over the city's underworld had little to do with the weather. On February 14, 1930, Sam Catalanot died of pneumonia at age 36. His lavish funeral, 2,000 attendees and $20,000 cost, was a who's who of Detroit's Italian community. It marked the end of an era. Catalanot had kept a fragile peace among Detroit's gangs. Catalanot had served as president of the Unione Siciliana, a fraternal organization that, while maintaining its legitimate charitable purposes, had become deeply intertwined with the city's criminal enterprises. His death created more than just a leadership vacuum. It opened a chasm that would soon consume the very foundations of Detroit's organized crime families. The Unione Siciliana had evolved far beyond its original mission of providing assistance to Sicilian immigrants. Under Catalanot's guidance, it had become a crucial mediating force, helping to resolve disputes between competing factions and maintaining a delicate balance of power. With his steady hand removed from the equation, old tensions that had simmered beneath the surface began to boil over. Joe Lemaire, whose ambitions had long been apparent to those who knew him well, saw opportunity in the chaos. Born in Sicily and immigrated to Detroit as a young man, Lemaire had built his reputation through a combination of shrewd business sense and an unflinching willingness to use violence when negotiations failed. He understood that controlling the Unione Siciliana meant more than symbolic leadership. It represented access to networks of influence that extended throughout the Italian-American community. Lemaire's bid for power was not without substantial backing. From New York, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria lent his considerable support to Lemaire's cause. Masseria, one of the most powerful crime bosses on the East Coast, had his own reasons for wanting an ally in Detroit's leadership. The city's proximity to Canada made it invaluable for smuggling operations, and Masseria understood that a loyal subordinate controlling Detroit's criminal landscape would serve his broader territorial ambitions. However, Lemaire's ascension was far from guaranteed. The East Side crews, those families and independent operators who controlled territory from downtown Detroit, extending toward the affluent Grosse Pointe communities, had their own vision for the future. These men, many of whom traced their ancestry to the same Sicilian villages, had developed strong loyalties to Salvatore Maranzano, Masseria's primary rival in what was becoming known as the Castellamarese War. The East Siders rallied around two potential leaders, who they believed could provide the steady guidance the organization desperately needed. Gaspar Milazzo, a respected figure whose family had deep roots in the community, commanded loyalty through his reputation for fairness and his extensive legitimate business interests. Alongside him stood Mealy, whose connections to both the old country traditions and the new American opportunities made him an attractive candidate for leadership. As winter gave way to spring, the political maneuvering that had characterized the immediate aftermath of Catalanot's death began to take on more dangerous dimensions. The competing factions were no longer content with behind-the-scenes negotiations and formal meetings. The stakes were simply too high and the potential rewards too substantial for the matter to be resolved through discussion alone. During this period of uncertainty, another significant development occurred that would reshape the entire conflict. The Rivalry brothers, who had operated their river gang along the Detroit River with a degree of independence that set them apart from the established families, found themselves at a crossroads. Led by Pietro Licavoli, known throughout the underworlds by his distinctive nickname Horseface Pete, the river gang had carved out a profitable niche in the smuggling operations that moved contraband across the international waterway. Pietro Licavoli was a man whose appearance matched his intimidating reputation. Born in Sicily, he had arrived in America as a teenager and quickly learned that survival in the New World required both intelligence and ruthlessness. His gang's control of strategic positions along the river had made them wealthy, but it had also made them valuable allies for whichever faction could secure their loyalty. The death of Catalanot presented Licavoli with both opportunity and danger. Operating independently had served his organization well during stable times, but the emerging conflict threatened to disrupt the careful balance that had allowed smaller operations to thrive. After careful consideration of his options, Licavoli made the decision that would prove crucial to the coming struggle. Rather than attempt to maintain his independence in an increasingly volatile environment, Pietro Licavoli chose to merge his river gang with the Tocco Zerilli organization. This alliance brought immediate benefits to both parties. The Tocco Zerilli family gained access to additional manpower at a critical time, along with the river gang's extensive knowledge of smuggling routes and their established relationships with Canadian contacts. For Licavoli, the merger provided the protection and legitimacy that came with being part of a larger, more established organization. His men retained their specialized roles in the river operations, but they now operated under the broader umbrella of one of Detroit's most powerful families. The timing of this alliance would prove prophetic, as events were already in motion that would test every criminal organization in the city. As spring progressed and the last remnants of winter disappeared from Detroit streets, the competing factions began to abandon any pretense of peaceful resolution. The hijacking started small, a truck here, a shipment there, but they quickly escalated in both frequency and boldness. Lemaire's men, emboldened by their boss's connections to Mafia and confident in their growing strength, began targeting operations controlled by the East Side crews. The East Siders responded in kind, launching their own operations against Lemaire's interests. Gambling establishments found themselves the target of sudden raids, not by law enforcement, but by rival criminals seeking to disrupt each other's revenue streams. The careful territorial boundaries that had been respected during Catalanot's leadership began to blur as each faction sought to expand its influence at the expense of its competitors. The beatings that accompanied these business disputes served a purpose beyond immediate intimidation. In the world of organized crime, reputation was currency, and each act of violence sent a message throughout the community about which faction was ascending and which was vulnerable. The men who carried out these attacks understood that they were participating in more than simple criminal enterprises. The escalating conflict did not go unnoticed by law enforcement agencies, though their ability to intervene was limited by the same factors that had always hampered their efforts against organized crime. The perpetrators of these attacks were disciplined professionals who understood the importance of silence, and the victims were reluctant to cooperate with authorities who they viewed as either corrupt or ineffective. Moreover, the violence was carefully calibrated to avoid attracting too much attention from the general public. The men involved in these disputes were not common street criminals driven by passion or desperation. They were businessmen, albeit illegal ones, who understood that excessive violence would eventually provoke a law enforcement response that could threaten all of their operations. As spring turned towards summer, it became increasingly clear that the death of Sam Catalanot had unleashed forces that could not be easily contained. What had begun as a succession dispute was evolving into something far more dangerous, a comprehensive war for control of Detroit's criminal enterprises. The various factions had committed too much and invested too heavily in the conflict to consider retreat. The seeds of this conflict, planted in the fertile ground of ambition and watered with the blood of increasing violence, were beginning to sprout. The harvest that would follow would reshape not only Detroit's criminal landscape, but would send ripples throughout the entire structure of organized crime in America. The players had taken their positions, the alliances had been formed, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of the Motor City's underworld for generations to come. In the quiet moments between the violence, as the city went about its daily business largely unaware of the storm brewing in its shadows, the men involved in this emerging conflict understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The time for negotiations and political maneuvering had passed, replaced by a grimmer reality where survival would depend on strength, loyalty, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect one's territory and interests. The seeds of conflict had been sown, and soon the entire city would witness their bitter fruit. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Fisher's Fish Market on East Verna Highway, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where ice-packed displays held the day's catch. It was Saturday, May 31st, 1930, and the familiar sounds of Detroit's East Side, children playing in nearby streets, the distant rumble of automotive plants, the occasional streetcar bell, created a backdrop of ordinary urban life. Yet within the confines of this modest fish market, events were about to unfold that would forever alter the landscape of organized crime, not just in Detroit, but across the entire nation. Gaspar Milazzo moved slowly through the market's entrance, his 62-year-old frame carrying the weight of decades spent navigating the treacherous waters of underworld politics. Known throughout the Italian-American community as the Peacemaker, Milazzo had earned his reputation through countless successful mediations between feuding families and factions. His silver hair and weathered face spoke of a man who had seen the evolution of organized crime from its earliest immigrant roots to its current sophisticated operations during Prohibition's final years. Beside him walked Sam Perino, whose actual name was Salvatore, a trusted associate who served as both bodyguard and advisor. Perino understood the delicate nature of their mission today, yet another attempt to broker peace between Detroit's increasingly volatile East Side and West Side factions. The invitation to this meeting had come through established channels, presented as a genuine opportunity to resolve mounting tensions that threatened to tear apart the city's carefully constructed criminal territories. The fish market provided what seemed like neutral ground. Its owner had connections to both sides, but belonged to neither faction, making it an acceptable venue for sensitive discussions. The strong scent of fresh fish and the casual atmosphere of a legitimate business offered perfect cover for the type of conversation that could not take place in more formal settings. Ice crunched underfoot as Milazzo and Perino made their way through the displays, past workers in stained aprons who continued their daily routines, seemingly unaware of the historic nature of the meeting about to unfold. Chester Lemaire's plan had been months in the making. The West Side leader had grown increasingly frustrated with his inability to expand operations eastward, where entrenched Sicilian families maintained iron control over lucrative smuggling routes from Canada. His original intention had been to eliminate Joe Zerilli and William Tocco, the rising powers of the East Side faction, but both men had developed suspicions about the proposed meeting. Their absence forced Lemaire to adjust his strategy, focusing instead on Milazzo, whose influence as a mediator posed a different but equally significant threat to West Side ambitions. Joe Amico and Elmer Macklin had positioned themselves carefully within the market's layout, concealed behind stacked crates and fishing equipment. Both men carried double-barreled shotguns, weapons chosen for their devastating effectiveness at close range and their ability to end any confrontation quickly and decisively. Amico, whose family had immigrated from southern Italy, understood the cultural significance of what they were about to do. The elimination of a respected elder violated fundamental codes that governed Italian-American criminal organizations. Yet loyalty to Lemaire and promises of expanded territory had overcome such traditional considerations. The conversation between Milazzo and the market's representatives began in the customary manner, with inquiries about family health and mutual acquaintances. This ritualistic approach to business meetings reflected deeply held cultural values, where personal relationships form the foundation of all professional arrangements. Milazzo spoke quietly but authoritatively, his voice carrying the weight of experience gained through decades of successful negotiations. He had survived the transition from street-level operations to sophisticated smuggling enterprises, adapting to changing times while maintaining respect for traditional methods. Parino remained alert but relaxed, his eyes periodically scanning the market's interior while maintaining the casual demeanor appropriate for a business discussion. His presence served multiple purposes: protection for Milazzo, witness to any agreements reached, and insurance against potential misunderstandings that might arise from the meeting. The two men had worked together for over a decade, developing the intuitive communication that allowed them to function as an effective team in dangerous situations. The signal came without warning. A subtle movement from one of the market workers, a prearranged cue that indicated the time had come. Amico and Macklin emerged from their concealment with practiced efficiency, shotguns raised and ready. The close confines of the fish market amplified the sound of their movement, but by then it was too late for either victim to react effectively. The first blast struck Milazzo directly in the head, the powder burns later discovered by police indicating that the weapon had been fired from extremely close range. The respected mediator fell immediately. His decades of experience and careful planning unable to protect him from the sudden violence that had become increasingly common in Detroit's criminal underworld. The sight of his collapse sent shockwaves through the market as workers dove for cover and customers fled toward the exits. Parino, mortally wounded but not immediately killed, managed to remain conscious long enough to identify his attackers. His final words, spoken to the first police officers to arrive, provided crucial evidence that would eventually link the assassination to the ongoing factional warfare. However, the code of silence that governed organized crime activities meant that this identification would prove insufficient for successful prosecution. The aftermath unfolded with the swift efficiency that characterized Detroit's police response to organized crime incidents. Officers arrived within minutes of the shooting, finding Milazzo's body surrounded by scattered ice and overturned fish displays. The powder burns on his head provided clear evidence of an execution-style killing, while witness statements described a carefully planned ambush rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Detective interviews with known West Side associates produced the typical responses: alibis that couldn't be verified but couldn't be disproven. Expressions of shock at the violence, and complete ignorance regarding potential motives or perpetrators. The police understood the futility of expecting cooperation from a community governed by its own codes of justice. But they documented everything meticulously, knowing that seemingly minor details might prove significant in future investigations. The press coverage emphasized the brazen nature of the attack, noting that it had occurred in broad daylight in a public place with multiple witnesses present. Newspaper headlines spoke of execution-style slayings and gang warfare, language that both sensationalized the events and reflected genuine public concern about organized crime's growing boldness. Editorial writers questioned whether law enforcement possessed adequate resources to combat criminal organizations that seemed to operate with impunity. Within Detroit's Italian-American community, reactions varied significantly depending on factional loyalties and personal relationships with the victims. Malazzo's death represented more than the loss of an individual. It symbolized the breakdown of traditional methods for resolving disputes peacefully. Older community members who remembered the respect accorded to mediators and peacemakers viewed the assassination as evidence that younger criminals no longer honored established customs. The elimination of the peacemaker sent ripples far beyond Detroit's city limits. In New York, where tensions between Castellamar's and opposing factions had been building for months, news of Malazzo's death provided confirmation that traditional methods of maintaining order were no longer effective. The respected elder had maintained correspondence with criminal leaders throughout the nation, and his violent death suggested that similar betrayals might occur anywhere. Joe Masseria, whose New York organization had been engaged in an increasingly bitter struggle with Salvatore Maranzano's Castellamarese faction, interpreted the Detroit assassination as evidence that established rules no longer constrained ambitious rivals. The carefully maintained balance of power that had prevented open warfare began to collapse as leaders on all sides concluded that preemptive action offered better protection than continued negotiation. Chester Lemaire's temporary success in seizing control of Detroit's criminal operations proved to be Pyrrhic victory, while the elimination of Malazzo removed a significant obstacle to West Side expansion. It also created a power vacuum that attracted unwanted attention from both law enforcement and rival organizations. More importantly, it demonstrated Lemare's willingness to violate fundamental codes of conduct, causing many potential allies to question his reliability as a partner. The Castellamares War that erupted in New York during the months following Malazzo's death drew its intensity partly from the precedent established in Detroit. The fish market ambush proved that respected elders could be eliminated if they posed obstacles to ambitious plans, encouraging similar thinking among New York's competing factions. Traditional restraints that had previously limited violence to specific circumstances no longer seemed applicable. As summer arrived in Detroit, the East Side faction began reorganizing under new leadership, with Joe Zerilli and William Tocco assuming greater authority in the absence of Malazzo's moderating influence with support, Melli and others. Their survival of Lamar's initial assassination attempt, combined with their mentor's violent death, reinforced their conviction that negotiation with the West Side offered no viable path forward. The stage was set for escalating violence that would eventually consume many of those who had participated in or benefited from the fish market ambush. The echoes of gunfire in Fisher's Fish Market would resonate for years to come, marking the end of an era when disputes could be resolved through mediation and the beginning of a period when survival depended on striking first. In the quiet moments after the police had finished their investigation and the market had been cleaned, few could have imagined that this single afternoon's violence would contribute to a transformation of organized crime that would reshape the criminal landscape across the entire United States. The legacy of Gaspar Milazzo, the peacemaker, lived on in the memories of those who had benefited from his mediation skills, even as his death became a symbol of changing times in America's criminal underworld. The early evening of July 3, 1930, would mark one of the most brazen acts of violence in Detroit's organized crime war. As the sun began its descent over the Motor City, the conflict that had been simmering in the neighborhoods and warehouses was about to spill into the heart of downtown Detroit, transforming the LaSalle Hotel into an unlikely battlefield. The LaSalle Hotel stood as one of Detroit's most prominent establishments, its elegant facade on Adelaide Street serving businessmen, travelers, and the city's more respectable citizens. On this particular evening, however, it would become the scene of an encounter that would forever link Detroit's underworld struggles with the broader criminal networks stretching across the Midwest. William Cannon. Cannon had earned his nickname through a reputation for explosive violence. Born in Chicago's rough South Side neighborhoods, Cannon had built his criminal career on extortion and intimidation. His partner, George Collins, shared similar roots in the Windy City's criminal underworld. Together, they adventured into Detroit territory, drawn by the opportunities presented by the ongoing family conflicts and the city's booming illegal liquor trade. The two Chicago visitors had arrived in Detroit with specific business in mind. Their extortion operations required face-to-face meetings, territorial negotiations, and the kind of personal presence that could not be conducted from afar. With them traveled Mike Stitzel, another associate whose role in their Detroit venture would soon take an unexpected and violent turn. On the other side of this deadly equation stood three men whose names would become forever linked to this July evening: Leo Salura, Angelo Livci, and Theodore Pizzino. These East Side operators represented the local interests that viewed the Chicago intrusion as both a challenge to their authority and a threat to their carefully maintained territorial arrangements. As the clock approached 6 in the evening, the summer heat hung heavy over downtown Detroit. The streets bustled with the usual mixture of legitimate business and the more shadowy transactions that had become commonplace during Prohibition. Near the side entrance of the LaSalle Hotel, a car bearing Illinois license plates drew the attention of the three Detroit men. The vehicle itself told a story. Its out-of-state plates marked its occupants as outsiders, while its positioning near the hotel's discreet side entrance suggested a meeting of some significance. For Salura, Livci, and Pizzino, the site represented an opportunity to address what they viewed as an unwelcome encroachment on their territory. The initial approach appeared routine enough. The three Detroit men walked calmly toward the Illinois vehicle, their movement suggesting a planned encounter rather than a chance meeting. Witnesses would later describe the scene as almost conversational in its opening moments, with the groups exchanging words through the car's window. What began as a verbal exchange rapidly escalated into deadly violence. The conversation, conducted through the car's open window, grew heated as territorial claims and business arrangements became the subject of dispute. The exact words exchanged would never be fully documented, but their effect was immediate and catastrophic. Leo Salura, whether responding to a perceived threat or acting on predetermined intentions, drew his weapon and fired multiple shots through the car window. The confined space of the vehicle amplified the horror of the attack, as William Cannon and George Collins found themselves trapped with nowhere to flee. The gunfire echoed through the downtown streets, sending pedestrians scrambling for cover and alerting nearby police officers to the unfolding tragedy. Within moments, 2 men lay dead in the Illinois vehicle, while Mike Stitzel, wounded but alive, would become the sole survivor of the encounter. The brazen nature of the attack, occurring in broad daylight at one of Detroit's most prestigious hotels, sent shockwaves through both the criminal underworld and legitimate society. Police officers arriving at the scene found a tableau of violence that underscored the escalating nature of the city's organized crime conflicts. Leo Celura, perhaps recognizing the gravity of what had transpired, would later claim self-defense in the shooting. His assertion that he had acted to protect himself and his associates reflected the complex dynamics of territorial disputes, where the line between aggression and defense often blurred beyond recognition. Angelo Livecchi and Theodore Pizzino, identified as accomplices in the attack, faced the immediate prospect of arrest and prosecution. Their involvement in the violence would tie them to a crime that had elevated the ongoing underworld conflicts from neighborhood disputes to front-page news. Detroit police, already stretched thin by the ongoing wave of organized crime violence, launched an intensive investigation into the LaSalle Hotel murders. The prominence of the location and the boldness of the attack demanded a comprehensive response that would demonstrate the authorities' commitment to maintaining order in the city's business district. Witness testimony proved both crucial and challenging to obtain. The downtown location meant numerous potential witnesses to the shooting, but the climate of fear surrounding organized crime violence made many reluctant to come forward with information. Those who did speak with investigators provided a picture of a planned confrontation that had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. The investigation revealed the complex web of relationships connecting Chicago and Detroit criminal operations. Cannon and Collins's presence in Detroit was not random, but represented a deliberate expansion of Chicago interests into Motor City territory. Their deaths would serve as a stark warning about the consequences of such territorial ambitions. A grand jury, presented with the evidence gathered by Detroit police, handed down indictments against all 3 suspected shooters. The charges reflected the serious nature of the crime and the community's demand for justice in what had become a symbol of the city's struggle with organized violence. The legal proceedings would unfold over several years, reflecting both the complexity of the case and the challenges of prosecuting organized crime figures. In June 1931, Angelo Livecchi and Theodore Pizzino faced trial for their roles in the double murder. The courtroom proceedings provided a rare public glimpse into the methods and motivations of Detroit's criminal organizations. Both men were ultimately convicted of second-degree murder, receiving life imprisonment sentences that reflected the severity of their crimes. The convictions represented a significant victory for law enforcement in their ongoing battle against organized crime violence. Leo Celura, the man who had pulled the trigger in the LaSalle Hotel shooting, proved more elusive than his associates. Following the murders, he disappeared from Detroit, beginning a years-long flight from justice that would take him across state lines and into hiding. For 6 years, Celura remained at large, demonstrating the resources and connections available to experienced criminal operators. His ability to evade capture spoke to the sophisticated networks that supported organized crime figures, and the challenges facing law enforcement agencies in tracking fugitives across state boundaries. When Celura was finally apprehended in 1936, his capture marked the end of one of Detroit's most prolonged manhunts. His return to face trial in 1937 would complete the legal circle begun with the LaSalle Hotel murders 7 years earlier. The LaSalle Hotel double murder represented more than an isolated incident of criminal violence. The attack demonstrated how Detroit's organized crime conflicts had evolved from neighborhood disputes into a broader territorial war that could erupt anywhere in the city. The involvement of Chicago criminals in Detroit affairs reflected the interconnected nature of Midwest organized crime operations. The murders served as a violent reminder that territorial boundaries were not merely local concerns, but part of a larger criminal geography spanning multiple cities and states. For downtown Detroit, the shooting transformed the perception of safety in the city's business district. The LaSalle Hotel, previously viewed as a sanctuary from street violence, had become another battleground in the ongoing war between competing criminal factions. As news of the LaSalle Hotel murders spread through Detroit's neighborhoods, residents grappled with the reality of how deeply organized crime violence had penetrated their community. The boldness of the attack and its downtown location suggested that nowhere in the city remained entirely safe from the escalating conflicts. The murders also highlighted the challenges facing law enforcement agencies struggling to maintain order amid the chaos of Prohibition-era crime. Despite their eventual success in prosecuting those responsible, the years-long investigation and lengthy legal proceedings underscored the resources required to combat organized criminal activities. As 1930 continued, the LaSalle Hotel murders would be remembered as a turning point in Detroit's organized crime war. The violence had moved beyond the boundaries of ethnic neighborhoods and criminal hangouts, establishing a new level of brazenness that would characterize the conflicts to come. The 3 men who died or were wounded that July evening had become casualties in a war that extended far beyond personal grievances or business disputes. Their fate served as a stark reminder of the deadly serious nature of territorial conflicts in an era when violence remained the ultimate arbiter of criminal disputes. In the quiet aftermath of that violent evening, as police cordoned off the crime scene and investigators began their painstaking work, Detroit's criminal underworld had crossed another line from which there would be no return. The LaSalle Hotel would continue to serve its guests, but the memory of July 3, 1930, would forever mark it as a symbol of the city's struggle with organized crime violence. The summer of 1930 brought with it a humid stillness that seemed to settle over the neighborhoods of Detroit like a heavy blanket. In the working-class enclave of Hamtramck, families were beginning their Saturday morning routines as the sun climbed higher into what promised to be another sweltering July day. Children played in small yards between the closely built homes, while their parents prepared for a weekend that offered brief respite from the demands of factory work and the ongoing tensions of Prohibition-era life. At 3847 Belmont Street, the Roth family home stood quietly among its neighbors, a modest 2-story structure that housed what appeared to be an ordinary American family. Barney Roth, a man in his 30s with the weathered look of someone who had seen both sides of the law, lived here with his wife and their young children. To his neighbors, Roth might have seemed like any other resident of this predominantly Polish-American community. Perhaps a factory worker or small business owner, making his way through the challenging economic times. The reality of Barney Roth's life, however, was considerably more complex than his quiet domestic appearance might have suggested. Roth occupied a peculiar and dangerous position in the intricate web of law enforcement and organized crime that characterized Detroit during this period. He served as an undercover patrolman for the Hamtramck Police Department, a role that required him to navigate the shadowy spaces between legitimate law enforcement and the criminal enterprises that flourished under Prohibition. Before his current position, Roth had worked as an investigator. developing skills and contacts that made him valuable to both sides of the ongoing struggle between organized crime and law enforcement. This dual existence required a careful balancing act, as Roth maintained relationships with bootleggers, gamblers, and other criminal figures, while ostensibly serving the cause of justice. Such arrangements were not uncommon during this era, when the lines between legitimate authority and criminal enterprise often blurred in ways that would have been unthinkable in more stable times. The nature of Roth's work had brought him into contact with various figures in Detroit's underworld, including men like John Mites, a bootlegger who found himself facing legal troubles as the summer of 1930 progressed. Mites, whose exact age remains lost to history, was awaiting arraignment on larceny charges, a situation that placed him in the vulnerable position of needing assistance from those who understood how the system operated. In the complex ecosystem of Detroit crime, such assistance often came through intermediaries like Roth, who possessed knowledge of both criminal operations and law enforcement procedures. The relationship between men like Roth and Mites represented one of the many ways that Prohibition had corrupted traditional structures of authority and justice. Police officers found themselves in positions where they could profit from their knowledge of criminal activities, while criminals sought to purchase protection or information that might help them avoid prosecution. These arrangements, while dangerous, had become a normalized part of the urban landscape, creating a shadow economy of favors, information, and protection that operated parallel to official law enforcement. On the morning of July 5th, Roth was preparing for what he likely expected to be an ordinary Saturday. His wife was attending to household duties while their children moved about the house with the careless energy of youth, unaware of the tensions that shaped their father's professional life. The kitchen, like kitchens in homes throughout the neighborhood, was becoming the center of morning activity as the family gathered for breakfast. Earlier that week, Roth had received visitors at his home, 2 men who claimed to be seeking his services. Such visits were not unusual for someone in Roth's position, as his reputation as a person who could navigate legal difficulties had spread through certain circles. The men had presented themselves as potential clients, seeking the kind of assistance that Roth had provided to others in similar circumstances. Mrs. Roth would later recall that one of these men had specifically requested her husband's help, suggesting a level of familiarity with Roth's capabilities and connections. What neither Roth nor his family could have anticipated was that this initial visit represented something far more sinister than a simple business inquiry. The men who had come to his door were conducting a form of reconnaissance, observing the layout of the house, the family's routines, and the best opportunities for what they actually intended to accomplish. Their polite inquiries and professional demeanor masked intentions that would soon transform the quiet domesticity of the Roth household into something far more tragic. The practice of visiting potential targets under the guise of legitimate business had become a common method among those who carried out violence for organized crime groups. Such advanced visits allowed killers to familiarize themselves with their surroundings, identify potential obstacles or witnesses, and plan their approach and escape routes. For families like the Roths, who lived at the intersection of legitimate and illegitimate worlds, the difficulty of distinguishing between genuine clients and potential threats represented one of the ongoing dangers of their circumstances. As the morning of July 5th progressed, the 2 men returned to the Belmont Street house, their intentions now clear but still hidden from the family inside. They approached the home with the confidence of those who had already studied their target and planned their actions. The fact that they chose to return during breakfast time, when the family would be gathered together in the kitchen, suggests a callous disregard for the presence of innocent family members, particularly the children who would witness what was about to unfold. The kitchen, where the Roth family had gathered, represented the heart of their domestic life, a space where the ordinary routines of family meals and conversation normally provided refuge from the complexities and dangers of the outside world. On this particular morning, however, this sanctuary would become the scene of sudden violence that would forever alter the lives of those who survived it. When the two gunmen entered the house, they moved with the practiced efficiency of those who had performed such tasks before. One focused his attention on Barney Roth, while the other turned toward John Mites, who was present in the home at this early morning hour. The simultaneous nature of their actions suggests careful coordination and planning, indicating that both men were intended targets, rather than one being killed simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The shooting itself was swift and decisive, designed to eliminate both targets before they could resist or escape. The presence of Mrs. Roth and the children in the kitchen meant that the killers carried out their work in front of innocent witnesses, a fact that speaks to either their confidence in avoiding consequences or their complete disregard for the additional trauma their actions would cause. For Mrs. Roth, the sudden transformation of an ordinary Saturday morning into a scene of violence and death must have been overwhelming. In the space of a few moments, she had lost her husband and witnessed the murder of another man, all while trying to protect her children from the immediate physical and psychological harm of what was occurring around them. The aftermath of the shooting left the Hamtramck Police Department and other law enforcement agencies scrambling to understand not only who had carried out the killings, but why both men had been targeted simultaneously. Safety Commissioner Charles Weingar, speaking for the department, offered an explanation that reflected the complex realities of law enforcement during this period. According to Weingar, Roth had been killed because he had promised protection that he was ultimately unable to deliver, while Mites had been killed simply because he was present at the scene. This official explanation, while perhaps accurate, also revealed the extent to which corruption and the blending of legitimate and illegitimate activities had become normalized in Detroit law enforcement. The suggestion that Roth had been in the business of selling protection indicated that his role as an undercover officer had become entangled with private arrangements that placed him in conflict with organized crime figures who felt they had not received the services they had paid for. The killing of John Mites, according to Weingar's assessment, represented a different but equally troubling aspect of organized crime violence during this period. The willingness to kill individuals simply because they were witnesses to other crimes demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that went beyond settling specific disputes or sending targeted messages. Such actions created an atmosphere of fear that extended far beyond those directly involved in criminal activities. The investigation into the murders faced the typical challenges that characterized law enforcement efforts during this era. The reluctance of witnesses to come forward, the complexity of relationships between criminals and corrupt officials, and the general atmosphere of fear and mistrust made it extremely difficult to identify and prosecute those responsible for such crimes. Despite the public nature of the killings and the fact that they had occurred in front of witnesses, no arrests were reported in connection with the Roth and Mites murders. This failure to solve such a prominent case had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy for the families involved. The message sent by the successful murder of a law enforcement officer, even one whose loyalties may have been divided, was that nobody was beyond the reach of organized crime violence. The fact that the killers had struck during the morning hours in a residential neighborhood while children were present, demonstrated a level of boldness that suggested they felt little fear of consequences. For the residents of Hamtramck and surrounding areas, the Rothermites murders represented a significant escalation in the ongoing violence that had characterized the Prohibition era. The killing of law enforcement personnel, regardless of their potential involvement in corruption, crossed a line that heightened public anxiety about the growing power and reach of organized crime groups. Families throughout the region found themselves questioning whether anyone was truly safe from the violence that seemed to be spreading through all levels of society. The broader implications of these murders extended beyond their immediate impact on public safety. They demonstrated how the corruption fostered by Prohibition had created situations where law enforcement officers could become targets for the very criminal organizations they were supposed to be fighting. The complex relationships between police, politicians, and criminal enterprises had created a web of conflicting loyalties and competing interests that made traditional notions of justice and protection increasingly meaningless. As the summer of 1930 continued, the unsolved murders of Barney Roth and John Mites stood as a reminder of how thoroughly organized crime had penetrated the structures of law and order in Detroit. The quiet streets of Hamtramck, where families continued their daily routines in the shadow of this violence, reflected the broader struggle of urban communities trying to maintain normal life in abnormal times. The children who had witnessed the killings that Saturday morning would carry the memory of that violence with them as they grew up in a city where such events were becoming increasingly common. Their experience represented the human cost of the broader social transformation that Prohibition had brought about. As innocent families found themselves caught in conflicts that originated in the competing demands of law, profit, and survival. In the larger narrative of Detroit organized crime, the Roth and Mites murders marked another step in the evolution of criminal enterprises that were becoming increasingly bold and sophisticated in their operations. The coordination required to carry out simultaneous killings, the advanced planning evident in the initial reconnaissance visit, and the successful escape without immediate consequences all pointed to organizations that were learning to operate with the efficiency and ruthlessness of military units. As night fell on July 5, 1930, the Belmont Street house stood quiet once again. But the stillness now carried a weight of tragedy that would linger long after the immediate shock of the morning's events had passed. In homes throughout Hamtramck and Detroit, families locked their doors with a heightened awareness that the violence which had claimed Barney Roth and John Mites could potentially reach anyone who found themselves on the wrong side of the complex and dangerous world that Prohibition had created. The unsolved nature of these murders would continue to cast a shadow over law enforcement efforts in the region, serving as a constant reminder of the limitations of traditional policing methods in the face of increasingly organized and ruthless criminal enterprises. For the families of the victims, the lack of justice represented not only personal loss, but also a broader failure of the systems that were supposed to protect innocent citizens from such violence. On a warm summer afternoon in Detroit, July 7, 1930, the city hummed with the ordinary sounds of daily life. Streetcars clanged along their routes, children played in neighborhood yards, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from corner bakeries. At precisely noon, when church bells marked the midday hour across the city, two brothers named Giuseppe and Salvatore Gaglio pulled their automobile to the side of Mack Avenue, unaware that this routine stop would mark their final moments together. The Gaglio brothers had arrived in Detroit, like so many others, during the great wave of Sicilian immigration in the early 1900s. Giuseppe, the elder at 34, possessed the quiet intensity common among men who had learned to navigate dangerous waters from a young age. His younger brother, Salvatore, 28, shared the same dark eyes and weathered hands that spoke of hard work and harder choices. Born in the hills outside Palermo, they had crossed the Atlantic carrying the dreams of their generation, hopes for prosperity in America's industrial heartland. In Detroit's underworld of 1930, the Gaglio brothers had aligned themselves with what law enforcement termed the West Side Faction, a collection of Sicilian families who controlled bootlegging operations in the city's western neighborhoods. This affiliation placed them in direct competition with rival groups operating from Detroit's east side, where territorial boundaries had been drawn not by city planners, but by the unforgiving mathematics of Prohibition-era profits. The gas station at 63020 Mack Avenue stood as a modest outpost of legitimate commerce in a neighborhood where boundaries between legal and illegal enterprise had long since blurred. On this particular Monday afternoon, the station's owner watched from his small office as the Gaglio brothers' dark sedan pulled alongside the building. Giuseppe stepped from the driver's seat, his movements deliberate and unhurried, while Salvatore emerged from the passenger side, already rolling up his sleeves for the work ahead. The rear tire had gone flat somewhere during their journey across the city, a common enough occurrence on Detroit's rough streets, where construction and neglect had left the pavement scarred with potholes and debris. Giuseppe opened the trunk to retrieve their spare tire, while Salvatore knelt beside the disabled wheel, his fingers working to loosen the lug nuts. The brothers spoke quietly in their native Sicilian dialect, their voices carrying the easy familiarity of siblings who had shared both struggles and successes. Unknown to the Gaglio brothers, their routine stop had not gone unnoticed. In the complex web of surveillance and counter-surveillance that characterized Detroit's underworld, movement rarely occurred without observation. The East Side faction, led by men like Pietro Machine Gun Pete Corrado, maintained their own network of watchers and informants throughout the city. These scouts moved through the neighborhoods like shadows, noting arrivals and departures, tracking patterns, and reporting back to their superiors. Machine Gun Pete Corrado had earned his nickname through both his preferred weapon and his direct approach to territorial disputes. Born in Calabria, but raised in Detroit's eastern neighborhoods, Corrado understood that in the world of prohibition bootlegging, hesitation could prove fatal. His crew operated with military precision, their actions guided by the cold logic of business competition rather than personal animosity. When opportunities presented themselves to weaken rival factions, Corrado's men had been trained to act swiftly and decisively. The automobile that pulled up to the gas station shortly after noon moved with purposeful intent. Its occupants had received word of the Gaglio brothers' location through channels that remained forever hidden from police investigation. The driver maintained a steady speed, neither hurrying nor dawdling, while his passengers prepared for what they viewed as a necessary business transaction in their ongoing commercial dispute. Giuseppe Gaglio looked up from the spare tire as the unknown vehicle approached. Years of living within Detroit's underworld had sharpened his instincts for danger, but the gas station's public location and the broad daylight had perhaps provided a false sense of security. Salvatore remained focused on the flat tire, his hands black with grease and road dust, unaware that their afternoon of mechanical difficulty was about to take a tragic turn. The attacking vehicle slowed as it drew alongside the gas station. Multiple occupants emerged simultaneously, their movements coordinated with the efficiency of men who had performed similar actions before. They carried both pistols and shotguns, weapons chosen for their effectiveness at close range rather than their subtlety. The afternoon air suddenly filled with the sharp crack of gunfire, a sound that sent nearby pedestrians diving for cover behind parked automobiles and storefronts. Giuseppe and Salvatore Gaglio fell beside their disabled automobile. Their lives ended in the space of a few violent seconds. The attackers departed as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the acrid smell of gunpowder and the profound silence that follows sudden violence. The gas station owner, cowering in his office, waited several long minutes before emerging to discover the scene that would forever mark this corner of Mack Avenue. Detroit police arrived within the hour, their investigation hampered by the universal reluctance of witnesses to provide detailed testimony about underworld activities. The official report noted few reliable details beyond the basic facts. 2 Sicilian men, known associates of bootlegging operations, had been killed in what appeared to be a professional execution. No arrests would be made, and the case would eventually join the growing collection of unsolved crimes that marked Detroit's Prohibition era. The deaths of Giuseppe and Salvatore Gaglio represented more than the loss of 2 individual lives. Within Detroit's West Side faction, their elimination removed 2 experienced operators who had helped maintain the delicate balance of power that characterized the city's underworld. Their absence would be felt not only by their immediate associates, but by the entire network of relationships that sustained bootlegging operations in their territory. For the East Side faction and Machine Gun Pete Corrado's crew, the successful elimination of the Gaglio brothers demonstrated their capability to strike at rivals even in daylight locations. This show of strength sent a clear message throughout Detroit's underworld. Territorial boundaries would be defended with lethal force, and challenges to East Side authority would be met with swift retaliation. The escalation of violence that followed the Gaglio brothers' deaths would continue to shape Detroit's organized crime landscape throughout the remainder of 1930. Each act of retaliation prompted counter-retaliation, creating a cycle of bloodshed that depleted the ranks of both factions, while enriching the funeral homes and frightening the legitimate businesses caught in the crossfire. As evening fell over Detroit on July the 7th, 1930, 2 families mourned the loss of sons and brothers who would never return home. The gas station at 63020 Mack Avenue was scrubbed clean, its concrete apron washed of the stains that marked where Giuseppe and Salvatore Gaglio had spent their final moments. Yet the consequences of that afternoon's violence would ripple outward through Detroit's underworld for months to come, a reminder of the deadly serious nature of America's great experiment with Prohibition. The Gaglio brothers had sought their fortune in America's promised land, only to discover that the price of prosperity in Detroit's underworld was measured in blood as well as dollars. Their story serves as a sobering reminder of the human cost hidden behind the romanticized tales of Prohibition-era bootlegging. A cost paid not only by those who chose the dangerous path of organized crime, but by the families and communities forever changed by the violence that followed in its wake. Tomorrow's sunrise would bring new challenges and new dangers to Detroit's remaining players in the bootlegging trade. But for Giuseppe and Salvatore Gaglio, the American dream had ended beside a disabled automobile on a summer afternoon. Their ambitions silenced by the harsh realities of territorial warfare in a city where boundaries were drawn in blood and fortunes were lost as quickly as they were made. In the summer of 1930, as Detroit sweltered under both the July heat and the crushing weight of Prohibition-era corruption, one voice cut through the static of radio waves to reach into homes across the Motor City. Gerald Jerry Buckley spoke to his listeners each evening from the modest studio of WMBC, housed within the elegant lobby of the LaSalle Hotel on Adelaide Street. His voice carried the authority of a man who had seen too much and the passion of someone who still believed change was possible. Buckley stood 39 years old that summer, a veteran of the Great War who had returned to find his beloved Detroit transformed into something he barely recognized. The city that had once represented American industrial might now serve as a battleground between competing criminal organizations, each vying for control of the lucrative liquor trade that Prohibition had driven underground. Where honest policemen once walked their beats, corrupt officers now collected weekly envelopes. Where legitimate businesses once thrived, speakeasies and gambling houses operated with impunity. For nearly 3 years, Buckley had used his radio program to name names, expose corruption, and rally citizens against the criminal element that had infected their city's government. He spoke of police commissioners who looked the other way, of judges who dismissed cases for the right price, of a mayor who seemed more interested in protecting his criminal allies than serving the people who had elected him. His audience grew with each broadcast, drawn to his fearless commentary and his unwavering belief that Detroit could be saved from itself. The corruption Buckley railed against was not merely theoretical. It was woven into the very fabric of the city's governance, reaching from the precinct level up to the mayor's office itself. Mayor Charles Bowles, a man who had campaigned on promises of reform, had instead proven to be perhaps the most corrupt official Detroit had ever seen. Under his administration, gambling houses operated openly, bootleggers worked without fear of arrest, and the Purple Gang expanded their operations with virtual immunity from prosecution. Buckley understood that his crusade made him enemies. The same criminal organizations that had turned Detroit into their personal fiefdom would not tolerate indefinite exposure. Yet he continued his broadcasts, night after night, calling for citizens to demand accountability from their elected officials. His voice became the conscience of a city that had seemingly lost its moral compass. The breaking point came with Buckley's relentless campaign to recall Mayor Bowles from office. Night after night, he detailed the mayor's connections to organized crime, his protection of known criminals, and his administration's systematic corruption of city services. The recall effort gained momentum as ordinary citizens, inspired by Buckley's courage, began organizing petition drives and attending rallies. The movement represented something the criminal establishment had not faced before: genuine grassroots opposition, backed by irrefutable evidence of corruption. On July 22, 1930, the recall election took place. Despite attempts at intimidation and vote buying, the citizens of Detroit spoke clearly. Mayor Bowles was removed from office by an overwhelming margin, the first successful mayoral recall in the city's history. For Jerry Buckley, it represented vindication of his 3-year campaign. That evening, his radio broadcast crackled with satisfaction as he thanked his listeners for their courage in standing up to corruption. What Buckley did not fully understand was the complexity of his position within Detroit's criminal landscape. While he had built his reputation as a crusader against organized crime, he was not entirely separate from the underworld he criticized. Like many public figures in Prohibition-era Detroit, Buckley had developed relationships with certain criminal elements. Relationships that provided him with information, but also compromised his independence. Some suspected he had financial arrangements with gambling interests, while others believed he received protection money from rival factions seeking to damage their competitors. The Rivalry organization, known throughout Detroit as the East Side Gang, had particular reason to view Buckley with suspicion. Led by the brothers Pete and Thomas Licavoli, this Sicilian-American crime family controlled much of the city's eastern territory, running gambling operations, protection rackets, and bootlegging enterprises with ruthless efficiency. Unlike some of the more publicity-conscious criminal leaders, the Licavoli brothers preferred to operate in shadows, avoiding the kind of public attention that Buckley's broadcasts inevitably brought. Within the Licavoli organization, several key figures had grown increasingly concerned about Buckley's influence. Joe Bomarito, a trusted soldier in the family's operations, had reportedly lost significant money due to police raids that followed Buckley's exposés. Ted Bazzino, another family associate, had seen his gambling establishment closed after Buckley specifically mentioned its location during one of his broadcasts. For these men, Buckley represented more than just an annoyance. He was a direct threat to their livelihood. The decision to eliminate Buckley was not made hastily. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1930, various criminal organizations had discussed the radio commentator's fate. Some argued that killing such a prominent figure would bring unwanted attention from state and federal authorities. Others contended that allowing Buckley to continue his crusade would embolden other reformers and ultimately prove more damaging than any investigation his death might trigger. The successful recall of Mayor Bowles tipped the balance. For the criminal establishment, Buckley's victory represented an existential threat. If a radio commentator could mobilize public opinion to remove a corrupt mayor, what other changes might he inspire? The decision was made. Jerry Buckley had to be silenced permanently. July 23rd began like any other day for Buckley. He arrived at the LaSalle Hotel in the early evening, preparing for his regular broadcast. The hotel lobby bustled with its usual activity guests, checking in and out, businessmen meeting for dinner, couples heading to the hotel's restaurant. The WMBC studio occupied a corner of the lobby, its glass windows allowing passers-by to watch the radio personalities at work. Buckley's broadcast that evening was particularly celebratory. He spoke at length about the successful recall election, thanking his listeners for their participation in the democratic process. He outlined his hopes for the new administration and his belief that Detroit was finally turning a corner in its fight against corruption. Those who knew him well noted that he seemed more relaxed than he had been in months, as if the recall victory had lifted a great weight from his shoulders. As the broadcast concluded, around 1003 in the morning, Buckley began gathering his notes and preparing to leave. The hotel lobby had quieted considerably, with only a few guests and staff members moving about. The late hour suited Buckley, who often preferred the peaceful walk home through Detroit's empty streets to clear his mind after his emotionally charged broadcasts. At approximately 1:50 a.m., the hotel's telephone operator received a call for Jerry Buckley. The caller, speaking in a calm, professional tone, identified himself as someone with urgent information about corruption in the police department. He requested that Buckley meet him in the hotel lobby to discuss the matter. Such calls were not unusual for the radio commentator, who regularly received tips from sources throughout the city. Buckley descended from the radio studio into the lobby, looking around for his caller. Near the hotel's entrance, 3 men sat at a small table, apparently engaged in quiet conversation. One looked up as Buckley approached, gesturing for him to join them. The radio commentator, perhaps recognizing one of the men or simply assuming they were his contacts, walked toward the table. As Buckley drew near, 2 of the men rose from their chairs. In one fluid motion, they drew pistols from beneath their jackets and opened fire at point-blank range. The sound of gunshots echoed through the marble lobby like thunder, shattering the peaceful atmosphere of the late-night hour. 11 shots were fired in rapid succession, the gunmen's aim precise and deadly. Buckley collapsed to the marble floor, his blood spreading across the hotel's elegant stonework. The third man, who had remained seated throughout the shooting, calmly stood and walked toward the hotel's exit. All 3 killers departed through different doors, disappearing into the Detroit night with the practiced efficiency of experienced professionals. Hotel staff and the few remaining guests rushed to Buckley's aid, but their efforts were futile. The radio commentator, who had spent 3 years fighting corruption, with nothing but his voice and his courage, had been silenced forever. He died on the cold marble floor of the LaSalle Hotel lobby, surrounded by the shocked faces of strangers, far from the family and friends who had supported his crusade. News of Buckley's assassination spread through Detroit like wildfire. By dawn, crowds had gathered outside the LaSalle Hotel, some weeping openly, others standing in stunned silence. The man who had given voice to their frustrations and hope to their dreams of a better city was gone, cut down by the very forces he had spent his life opposing. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Citizens who had never attended a political rally took to the streets, demanding justice for Buckley and accountability for the corruption that had made his murder possible. Labor unions called for work stoppages, church leaders organized prayer vigils, and civic organizations demanded immediate action from state authorities. Governor Fred Greene, recognizing that Detroit's local law enforcement could not be trusted to investigate Buckley's murder effectively, ordered state police into the city. For the first time since the Civil War, Michigan's capital city found itself under what amounted to martial law, with state troopers patrolling streets that local police had failed to protect. The investigation that followed was both extensive and frustrating. Detectives questioned dozens of known criminals, following leads that stretched from the Purple Gang's headquarters to the Licavoli family's strongholds on the east side. Within days, authorities had arrested Ted Pizzino and Joe Bomarito, along with several other suspected associates of the Licavoli organization. The evidence against them seemed substantial. Witness testimony placed them in the hotel that night, and their known grievances against Buckley provided clear motive. Yet, as the investigation progressed, a troubling picture emerged. Buckley's own connections to certain criminal elements complicated the case significantly. Bank records revealed unexplained deposits in his accounts, and several witnesses came forward claiming the radio commentator had received protection money from gambling interests. The clear-cut narrative of an honest crusader murdered by corrupt criminals began to blur into something far more complex. The grand jury proceedings stretched for months, with prosecutors struggling to present a coherent case. While the evidence against the suspected gunman was strong, defense attorneys successfully argued that Buckley's own criminal associations created reasonable doubt about their client's motives. Perhaps the radio commentator had been killed not for his crusading journalism, but for failing to meet obligations to his criminal partners. Perhaps his death was the result of an internal dispute within Detroit's underworld, rather than an assassination ordered by those he had exposed. In the end, no one was convicted for Jerry Buckley's murder. Ted Pizzino, Joe Bomarito, and the other suspects were released, their alibis holding up under scrutiny or the evidence against them proving insufficient for conviction. The failure to secure justice for such a high-profile victim sent a chilling message throughout Detroit. Even the most prominent citizens were not safe from underworld violence. The impact of Buckley's assassination extended far beyond the failure to convict his killers. The massive public outcry and the subsequent state police occupation of Detroit forced the criminal organizations that had operated so brazenly to retreat into the shadows. The Licavoli family, along with other major crime families, significantly reduced their public activities, recognizing that Buckley's death had brought a level of attention they could not afford. The Purple Gang, which had dominated Detroit's criminal landscape for years, found their operations severely disrupted by the increased law enforcement presence. Several high-ranking members were arrested on various charges, while others fled the city entirely. The bootlegging operations that had generated enormous profits were forced to scale back significantly as state authorities maintained their heightened vigilance. On July 26th, 3 days after his murder, Jerry Buckley was laid to rest in a ceremony that drew over 50,000 mourners. The funeral procession stretched for miles through Detroit's streets, with citizens from every neighborhood and every walk of life coming to pay their respects to the man who had spoken for them. Labor leaders walked alongside business owners, immigrants stood with native-born Americans, and people of all faiths gathered to honor a man who had embodied their hopes for a better city. The funeral marked not just the end of Jerry Buckley's life, but the conclusion of an era in Detroit's history. The brief moment when a single voice speaking truth through radio waves had seemed capable of reforming an entire city was over. The forces of corruption had demonstrated their power decisively, silencing their most prominent critic and warning others who might consider following his example. Yet Buckley's legacy lived on in ways his killers had not anticipated. The public revulsion at his murder created a lasting change in Detroit's political culture. Future mayors would find it much more difficult to maintain open relationships with criminal organizations, and police commissioners who showed obvious signs of corruption faced swift removal from office. The citizen activism that Buckley had inspired continued long after his death, creating a more engaged and vigilant electorate. As the summer of 1930 faded into autumn, Detroit's criminal families settled into a new reality. The days of operating with complete impunity were over, replaced by a more cautious approach that acknowledged the potential consequences of attracting too much public attention. The Licavoli organization, in particular, adopted a much lower profile, focusing on consolidating their existing territories rather than expanding their operations. The murder of Jerry Buckley had silenced one voice, but it had awakened thousands of others. In the marble lobby of the LaSalle Hotel, where bloodstains served as a permanent reminder of that terrible night, Detroit's transformation from a wide-open criminal haven to a more carefully regulated city had begun. The price of that transformation, paid in the blood of a man who had believed in the power of truth, would never be forgotten by those who had heard his voice crackling through their radio speakers, calling them to be better than they were. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city slept and the radio waves carried only static, some claimed they could still hear Jerry Buckley's voice echoing through the streets of Detroit, reminding citizens that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, and that sometimes, even in the darkest times, one voice speaking truth could light the way towards something better. On a quiet autumn evening in Detroit's east side, the shadows grew longer as darkness settled over the modest homes that lined the residential streets. It was the night of September 27, 1930, and within the walls of one particular house, a conversation was taking place that would forever alter the balance of power in the city's underworld. Giuseppe Marino, known throughout the neighborhoods as Moonlight Joe, had built his reputation through decades of careful maneuvering in Detroit's criminal landscape. At 53 years old, he had become something more than just another figure in organized crime. He was Chester Lemaire's most trusted lieutenant, his right-hand man in all matters of importance. Where Lemaire made the decisions, Marino ensured they were carried out with precision and discretion. The nickname Moonlight Joe had followed him since his younger days, earned through his preference for conducting business during the evening hours. While others worked under the harsh light of day, Marino understood the protective nature of darkness, the way shadows could conceal movements and conversations that required privacy. It was this understanding that had made him invaluable to Lamar's organization. On this particular evening, Marino was at home with his family, as was his custom. His house, like many in the neighborhood, was a modest two-story structure, the kind that reflected the working-class Italian families who had made this area their own. The front porch overlooked a tree-lined street, where children played during the day and neighbors gathered in the evenings to discuss the events of their lives. The relationship between Marino and Lamar had developed over many years, forged through shared experiences and mutual respect. While Lamar possessed the vision and the connections necessary to lead their organization, Marino provided the practical knowledge and street-level understanding that made their enterprises successful. He was the bridge between Lamar's strategic thinking and the daily operations that kept their business running smoothly. In the complex hierarchy of Detroit's organized crime families, Marino occupied a position of significant influence. He was not merely a soldier following orders, but rather a counselor whose advice carried weight in important decisions. His loyalty to Lamar was absolute, and this dedication had been tested through various challenges and territorial disputes over the years. The evening of September 27th had begun like any other. Marino had returned home after conducting his usual business around the city. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves, and the neighborhood had settled into its familiar rhythm of dinner preparations and family conversations. Children's voices could be heard from nearby yards as they played their final games before being called inside for the night. Inside the Marino household, the atmosphere was comfortable and familiar. Giuseppe's son was present, as were other family members who had gathered for what appeared to be an ordinary evening at home. The conversation was relaxed, touching on family matters and the everyday concerns that occupied the thoughts of working people throughout the city. However, this particular evening would prove to be anything but ordinary. Present in the house was a young man named Mike Rubino, just 17 years old, who had connections to the various crews operating in Detroit's underworld. Rubino represented the new generation of young men who were drawn to the opportunities and excitement that came with association to organized crime families. At 17, Rubino was at an age where young men often made decisions that would define the course of their entire lives. The Depression had created limited opportunities for legitimate advancement, and many Italian-American youth found themselves attracted to the more immediate rewards offered by criminal enterprises. For someone like Rubino, the chance to be associated with established figures like Marino represented both opportunity and danger. The exact sequence of events that followed remains clouded in the uncertainty that often surrounds such incidents. What is known is that sometime during the evening, a gun was present in the house, and in the span of a few moments, the trajectory of several lives was permanently altered. According to the official account that emerged later, Marino's own son would claim responsibility for the fatal shot that ended his father's life. The young man maintained that the shooting was accidental, a tragic result of mishandling a weapon within the confines of their family home. This explanation, while officially accepted, raised questions among those familiar with the complex relationships and tensions that existed within Detroit's criminal organizations. However, FBI files that would surface years later told a different story. According to federal investigators, it was Mike Rubino who fired the shot that killed Giuseppe Marino. This version of events suggested a more deliberate action, one that fit into the larger pattern of violence and retribution that characterized the ongoing power struggles within Detroit's underworld. The discrepancy between these two accounts reflects the complex web of loyalty, fear, and survival that governed life within organized crime families. If Rubino had indeed been the shooter, the subsequent confession by Marino's son represented an act of protection that came at tremendous personal cost. Such acts of sacrifice were not uncommon in a world where family loyalty often superseded legal consequences. Within the underground networks of Detroit's criminal organizations, a third interpretation of events gained currency. According to this version, Marino's son had been threatened or coerced into accepting responsibility for his father's death. This explanation suggested that powerful forces were at work, forces that could compel a young man to sacrifice his own freedom, to protect others, or to serve interests larger than his immediate family. The belief that the son had been pressured into his confession reflected the harsh realities of life within organized crime circles. In this world, individual choices were often constrained by the expectations and demands of the larger organization. A young man might find himself facing an impossible decision: accept responsibility for a crime he did not commit, or risk even greater consequences for himself and his family. When the police arrived at the Marino residence, they encountered a scene that appeared to support the family's account of an accidental shooting. The investigation that followed was brief and concluded with no charges being filed against anyone involved. Mike Rubino, who had been briefly detained, was released after Marino's son provided his statement accepting responsibility. The police response to Marino's death reflected the complex relationship that existed between law enforcement and organized crime in Detroit during this period. While the authorities were certainly aware of Marino's connections to Lemare's organization, proving criminal activity and solving crimes within the tight-knit Italian-American community presented ongoing challenges. For Chester Lemare, the loss of Giuseppe Marino represented more than the death of a friend and colleague. Marino had been his most reliable lieutenant, the person he depended upon to handle sensitive matters and maintain order within their organization. Without Marino's steady presence, Lemare found himself increasingly isolated within a landscape that was becoming more dangerous by the day. The timing of Marino's death was particularly significant, given the ongoing tensions between various factions within Detroit's organized crime community. The East Side Italian gang, led by the Licavoli brothers, had been expanding their influence and challenging established territorial arrangements. The loss of his key lieutenant left Lemare in a weakened position just when he needed trusted allies the most. In the days following the shooting, the ripple effects of Marino's death began to spread throughout the networks of relationships that connected Detroit's various criminal enterprises. Associates who had relied on Marino's guidance found themselves uncertain about their position within the organization. Business arrangements that had been maintained through Marino's personal relationships required renegotiation or restructuring. The funeral of Giuseppe Marino drew hundreds of mourners from throughout Detroit's Italian-American community. The ceremony reflected both his standing within legitimate society and his importance in the underground world that operated parallel to conventional business and social networks. Family members, neighborhood friends, and associates from various criminal enterprises gathered to pay their respects to a man who had commanded respect across multiple spheres of influence. For the young men who had been present on the night of September 27th, the events at the Marino household would cast a shadow over their future lives. Whether as perpetrator or as one who accepted responsibility for another's actions, each carried the weight of that evening's consequences. In the world of organized crime, such moments often defined a person's entire trajectory, determining their relationships, opportunities, and survival prospects for decades to come. The death of Giuseppe Moonlight Joe Marino marked the end of an era in Detroit's organized crime history. His passing removed a stabilizing influence from Chester Lemaire's organization at a time when such stability was desperately needed. In the months that followed, the consequences of this loss would become increasingly apparent as Lemaire struggled to maintain control over his territory and operations. As autumn deepened into winter, the vacant position left by Marino's death remained a source of weakness within Lemaire's organization. The careful balance of relationships and responsibilities that Marino had maintained began to shift, creating opportunities for rivals and uncertainty for allies. In the unforgiving world of organized crime, such vulnerabilities rarely remained unexploited for long. The night of September 27, 1930, had begun like any other in the modest house on Detroit's east side. By its end, the balance of power in the city's underworld had shifted irrevocably, setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape the landscape of organized crime in Detroit for years to come. The winter of 1931 brought an unusual quiet to Detroit's underworld, the kind of stillness that experienced men recognized as the calm before a storm. In the grand mansions along Granville Avenue, where successful bootleggers had established their households, the evening of February 6th began like any other. Chester Lemaire, known throughout the city as Big Chet, settled into his familiar routine, unaware that this would be his final night. Lemire had built his reputation methodically over the previous decade. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders of a man who had once worked the docks, he commanded respect through a combination of physical presence and business acumen. His mansion on Granville Avenue reflected his success in the liquor trade, a testament to how Prohibition had transformed ambitious men from humble backgrounds into wealthy power brokers. The 42-year-old Lemire had immigrated to Detroit as a child with his family from southern Italy, settling in the close-knit neighborhoods where old country traditions blended with American opportunities. By 1931, he had emerged as the undisputed leader of Detroit's West Side faction, controlling a substantial portion of the city's bootlegging operations. His territory stretched from the riverfront speakeasies to the suburban blind pigs, encompassing hundreds of establishments that depended on his protection and supply networks. That February evening, Lemaire's wife had departed the house earlier than usual, citing plans to visit relatives. This departure, which might have seemed routine to casual observers, represented the first element in a carefully orchestrated sequence of events. The couple had been married for 15 years, and Mrs. Lemaire typically maintained a predictable schedule around her husband's business activities. The mansion's security arrangements reflected the realities of leadership during Prohibition's final years. Joe Amico and Elmer Macklin served as the mayor's primary bodyguards, men whose loyalty had been tested through years of service. Amico, a veteran of the Great War, had joined Lemaire's organization in the mid-1920s, rising through the ranks based on his reliability and discretion. Macklin, younger but equally dedicated, had proven himself during several territorial disputes with rival factions. On this particular evening, however, both men made decisions that would later seem inexplicable to investigators. Following what they later claimed were direct instructions from Lemaire himself, they dismissed the additional security personnel who typically maintained watch around the property during evening hours. The front door, usually secured with multiple locks and monitored constantly, was left unlatched. These arrangements had been influenced by Peter Sugarhouse Pete Melly, a respected figure whose counsel Lemaire valued. Melly had spent considerable time that afternoon speaking privately with both Amico and Macklin, conversations that neighbors later recalled as unusually intense. The nature of these discussions would never be fully revealed, but their consequences became apparent as the evening progressed. At approximately 9 o'clock, as Lemaire sat in his study enjoying his customary evening coffee, an 18-year-old man named Michael Rubino approached the mansion. Known in certain circles as Mike the Enforcer, Rubino represented a new generation within Detroit's organized crime families. Younger men eager to prove themselves worthy of full membership in established organizations. Rubino had grown up in the East Side neighborhoods where the Zerilli and Tocco families maintained their influence. Unlike the older generation who had immigrated as adults, he was thoroughly American in his speech and mannerisms, yet deeply connected to the traditional codes that governed underworld relationships. His nickname reflected not established accomplishments, but rather the reputation he sought to build through decisive action. The promise that had motivated Rubino's presence at the Lemaire mansion that evening was significant within the context of organized crime traditions. According to later police informants, leadership figures from the East Side faction had indicated that successfully completing this assignment would result in his formal induction into their organization. A transformation from associate to maid member that represented the ultimate achievement for ambitious young men in their world. The actual assassination unfolded with remarkable simplicity. Rubino entered the mansion without resistance, moving quietly through rooms he had evidently studied in advance. Lemaire remained seated at his desk, focused on paperwork related to his various business interests, when Rubino approached from behind. A single gunshot to the head ended the life of Detroit's most prominent West Side leader, delivered with the precision that had earned the young man his reputation. The immediate aftermath revealed the careful planning that had preceded the evening's events. Within minutes of the shooting, both Amico and Macklin had departed the mansion, their absence ensuring that no witnesses remained to provide detailed accounts to investigating officers. The quiet neighborhood, accustomed to respecting the privacy of its prominent residents, offered no immediate assistance to arriving police. Detective work, in such cases, typically proceeded along predictable lines. Within 24 hours, authorities had arrested Joseph Zerilli and William Black Bill Tocco, both recognized leaders of East Side operations, along with the two bodyguards whose suspicious absence had drawn immediate attention. The speed of these arrests reflected both the obvious nature of the crime's motivations and the police department's familiarity with Detroit's underworld relationships. The legal proceedings that followed demonstrated the complexities of prosecuting organized crime cases during this period. While Amico and Macklin faced murder charges based on their apparent cooperation in the assassination, establishing their guilt beyond reasonable doubt proved challenging. Defense attorneys successfully argued that the men's absence from the mansion during the shooting could be explained by legitimate business elsewhere, and that any security lapses were the result of misunderstanding rather than conspiracy. After lengthy deliberations, both bodyguards were acquitted of all charges. The cases against Zerilli and Tocco were subsequently dropped due to insufficient evidence linking them directly to the assassination plot. This outcome, while frustrating to law enforcement officials, reflected the careful planning that had insulated the operation's architects from legal consequences. Michael Rubino's reward came with remarkable swiftness. According to underworld sources, He was formally inducted into the East Side organization the day following Lemaire's assassination, achieving the status that had motivated his participation in the plot. This rapid recognition served both to honor the young man's service and to demonstrate the faction's commitment to rewarding loyalty and effectiveness. The broader consequences of Lemaire's death extended far beyond the immediate participants. Mrs. Lemaire's subsequent disappearance from Detroit added another layer of mystery to the events, though whether her departure reflected personal choice or external pressure remained unclear. Joe Amico's vanishing in 1937 suggested that the assassination's aftermath continued to influence lives years after the original incident. For Detroit's underworld, February 6, 1931, marked a decisive shift in the balance of power between competing factions. The elimination of the West Side's most effective leader created opportunities for territorial expansion and organizational consolidation that would shape the city's criminal landscape throughout the remaining years of Prohibition and beyond. The mansion on Granville Avenue, once a symbol of successful bootlegging operations, stood empty for months following the assassination. Neighbors reported seeing occasional lights in the windows during subsequent winters, though whether these represented actual occupancy or merely the effects of imagination remained a subject of local speculation. As investigators closed their files on the Lemare case, the practical lessons of that February evening were absorbed by surviving members of Detroit's organized crime families. The importance of trusted security, the vulnerability of established routines, and the ruthless efficiency of carefully planned operations would influence protection strategies and business practices for decades to come. The snow that fell on Detroit that winter eventually melted, washing away the physical traces of violence while leaving the deeper changes to the city's underworld permanently embedded in its structure and relationships. Chester Big Chet, Lemaire's final evening, had concluded not just a life, but an entire era of West Side independence in Detroit's organized crime history. The echo of gunshots on Verna Highway on the morning of February 7, 1931, marked more than just the end of Chester Big Chet, Lemaire's life. Those fatal shots signaled the conclusion of Detroit's Crosstown War and ushered in a new era of organized crime in the Motor City. The ambitious leader who had dreamed of unifying Detroit's underworld under his banner was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum that would reshape the criminal landscape for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath of Lemaire's assassination, an uneasy quiet settled over Detroit's criminal territories. The various factions that had been locked in bloody conflict suddenly found themselves without a clear enemy to fight. The East Side families, who had formed their alliance against Lemaire's western expansion, now faced the question of what to do with their hard-won victory. The answer would prove to be one of the most significant developments in Detroit organized crime history. While the Crosstown War had ended, the Purple Gang's story was far from over. The notorious Jewish organization that had dominated Detroit's bootlegging operations through the 1920s was about to experience its most dramatic and self-destructive chapter. The very violence and ruthlessness that had built their fearsome reputation would ultimately lead to their downfall. By the early 1930s, internal tensions within the Purple Gang had reached a breaking point. The organization that had once operated with military-like discipline was fracturing along personal and financial lines. Old grudges festered, and suspicions of betrayal poisoned relationships that had been forged in the crucible of Prohibition-era warfare. The catalyst for the gang's destruction came from an unexpected source: 3 of their own members who had begun operating independently. Herman Paul, known to his associates as Jaime, had been a trusted member of the organization for several years. Isidore Sutka, who went by Joe in criminal circles, had proven his loyalty through numerous operations. Joe Lebowitz had similarly established himself within the gang's hierarchy through his reliable service and street connections. However, by 1931, these three men had begun conducting business on their own, cutting deals that bypassed the gang's traditional structure and keeping profits that should have been shared with the organization. In the rigid world of organized crime, such independence was viewed not merely as insubordination, but as outright betrayal. The Purple Gang's leadership, already paranoid from years of violent competition, saw these actions as an existential threat to their authority. September 1931 brought with it the crisp promise of autumn in Detroit, but for three members of the Purple Gang, it would be their final season. The leadership had decided that Herman Paul, Isidore Sutka, and Joe Lebowitz needed to be dealt with permanently. However, executing three experienced criminals required careful planning and an element of surprise that could only be achieved through deception. The plan that emerged was as simple as it was deadly. The three men would be invited to what they believed was a peace negotiation, a chance to resolve their differences with the organization and return to the fold. The location chosen was the Collingwood Manor apartment building, a respectable address that would seem appropriate for such a significant meeting. The very normalcy of the location was part of its appeal. Who would suspect that a brutal execution would take place in such an unremarkable setting? Sol Levine, a member of the gang who was not involved in the plot, was enlisted to provide transportation for the three marked men. Levine was told simply that he was helping to facilitate an important meeting, nothing more. His genuine ignorance of the true purpose would make his behavior natural and unsuspicious, ensuring that Paul, Sutka, and Lebowitz would arrive at their appointment without any sense of impending danger. On the appointed day, Levine dutifully picked up the three men and drove them to the Collingwood Manor. The conversation during the ride was likely routine, perhaps discussions of business opportunities, family matters, or the changing landscape of Detroit's underworld following the end of the Crosstown War. None of the passengers in Levine's vehicle could have imagined that they were traveling to an execution. When they arrived at the apartment building, Paul, Sutka, and Lebowitz entered the designated meeting location. What happened next was swift and brutal. Instead of finding gang leadership ready to negotiate, they encountered gunmen who had been waiting for their arrival. The three men were shot dead, their bodies left as a stark message to anyone else who might consider challenging the Purple Gang's authority. Sol Levine's role as the unwitting driver would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire conspiracy. When Detroit police investigators began examining the murders at Collingwood Manor, they quickly identified Levine as the man who had transported the victims to their deaths. Under intense interrogation, Levine's genuine shock and horror at learning the true purpose of his mission became apparent to detectives. Faced with the possibility of being charged as an accessory to murder, and genuinely outraged at having been manipulated into participating in the killings, Levine agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. His testimony provided investigators with crucial details about how the murders had been planned and executed. More importantly, he was able to identify the men who had been responsible for orchestrating the entire operation. The subsequent investigation revealed the involvement of Ray Bernstein, one of the Purple Gang's most prominent leaders, along with three other members of the organization. Bernstein had been a central figure in the gang's operations throughout the 1920s, known for his intelligence and ruthless efficiency. His participation in the Collingwood Manor murders demonstrated how seriously the gang's leadership had taken the perceived betrayal by Paul, Sutka, and Levowitz. When the case went to trial, Saul Levine's testimony proved devastating to the defendants. His detailed account of the events leading up to the murders, combined with physical evidence from the crime scene, painted a clear picture of premeditated execution. The prosecution successfully argued that while the three victims had indeed been members of the Purple Gang, their murders represented a criminal conspiracy that could not be excused by any code of underworld justice. Ray Bernstein and two of his co-conspirators were convicted of third-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction sent shockwaves through what remained of the Purple Gang's organization. The loss of such prominent leaders, combined with the publicity surrounding the trial, effectively marked the end of the gang as a major force in Detroit organized crime. While the Purple Gang was destroying itself through internal violence, the East Side families who had emerged victorious from the Crosstown War were taking steps to ensure that such destructive conflicts would not happen again. The death of Chester Lamar had removed the primary obstacle to their dominance, but the various leaders recognized that lasting peace required more than just the elimination of a rival. It required a new structure that could accommodate the interests and ambitions of multiple families while preventing the kind of territorial disputes that had characterized the late 1920s. The solution that emerged was unprecedented in Detroit's criminal history. Rather than allowing the traditional pattern of one family rising to dominance only to be challenged by rivals, the East Side leaders proposed something revolutionary, a unified partnership that would formally recognize the authority and territory of each participating family, while establishing mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully. This new organization became known as the Detroit Combination, and its formation marked a turning point in the city's underworld. The combination was structured around a ruling council that included representatives from the most powerful families, the Zerilli clan, with their deep roots in Detroit's Italian community, the Tocco family, known for their business acumen and political connections, the Melli organization, which had maintained strong ties to traditional Sicilian methods, the Prisiola group, respected for their operational efficiency, and the Licavoli family, whose reputation for both violence and restraint made them valuable partners in the new arrangement. This council-based approach represented a sophisticated evolution in organized crime governance. Rather than relying on the personality and ambition of a single leader, as the mayor had attempted to do, the combination distributed power among multiple families while creating formal processes for making collective decisions. Territorial boundaries were clearly defined and mutually respected. Business opportunities were shared according to agreed-upon formulas. Most importantly, disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than violence. The absorption of remnants from both the Purple Gang and the River Gang into this new structure demonstrated the combination's pragmatic approach to consolidating power. Rather than simply destroying these organizations, the council recognized that their members possessed valuable skills and connections that could benefit the overall enterprise. Former Purple Gang associates found new roles within the combination's operations, bringing their expertise in labor relations and illegal gambling. River Gang veterans contributed their knowledge of waterfront operations and smuggling routes. The Detroit Combination's approach to organized crime represented a marked departure from the chaotic violence that had characterized the Prohibition era. Where previous organizations had relied primarily on intimidation and brute force, the combination emphasized business-like efficiency and long-term planning. This shift reflected both the changing nature of illegal opportunities in the post-Prohibition era and the hard-learned lessons of the Crosstown War. Under the combination's rule, Detroit's underworld experienced an unprecedented period of stability. The territorial wars that had claimed so many lives during the 1920s became largely a thing of the past. Instead of fighting over boundaries, the various crews focused their energy on developing new revenue streams and expanding their legitimate business interests. This peaceful environment allowed organized crime in Detroit to become more sophisticated and ultimately more profitable than it had ever been during the violent years of Prohibition. The success of this model would influence organized crime development throughout the Midwest. Other cities watched Detroit's transformation with interest, and several attempted to implement similar coalition-based structures in their own territories. The Detroit combination became a case study in how criminal organizations could evolve beyond simple gang warfare to become complex business enterprises capable of operating profitably for decades. As the 1930s progressed, the wisdom of the combination's founders became increasingly apparent. While other cities continued to experience periodic gang wars and leadership upheavals, Detroit's underworld remained remarkably stable. The ruling council system proved capable of adapting to changing circumstances, from the end of Prohibition through the challenges of the Great Depression and beyond. The assassination of Chester Lemaire had ended one chapter in Detroit's criminal history, but it had also opened another. The Crosstown War's conclusion marked not just the defeat of one man's ambitions, but the beginning of a new model for organized crime that would influence illegal enterprises far beyond the borders of the Motor City. In the quiet of that February morning in 1931, when gunshots echoed across Verna Highway, no one could have predicted that they were witnessing the birth of one of America's most enduring criminal organizations. The Purple Gang's violent self-destruction served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of internal conflict, while the Detroit combination's peaceful prosperity demonstrated the advantages of cooperation and structured governance. Together, these contrasting outcomes would shape how organized crime operated in Detroit for generations to come, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the specific events of 1931.